Welcome. My name is Chris Ajemian. I'm the CEO and founder of Kate's Tutoring Educational Services and your co-host for today. I'll be joined again by my good friend, Michael Muska, founder of Relativity College Counseling, who has worked in admissions at Brown, Cornell, Phillips Andover, and EF Academy, among many others. Our topic today is an update on COVID-19's impact on college admissions, with particular emphasis on what we're seeing with the waitlist and what we're hearing from colleagues in university admissions. But most importantly, we hope that you and your family are all well and healthy during this time and making your way. Michael, always great to see you. Thank you so much again for joining us. You're doing okay today, yeah?
Good to see you, Chris. Yeah, this is, I guess, our third session together doing this, and
yeah, I think so.
Probably we've got more to go. So yes, good.
There's certainly a long road ahead, so I'm very happy to take that journey with you. So again, just a few housekeeping things to start. I'll facilitate the conversation. If you do have questions at any point in time, please put them in the Q&A panel, which you can access by scrolling over the bottom of your screen or wherever your sort of toolbar is in your screen. And additionally, for the best experience, you may want to set your screen to gallery view. So what you can do by scrolling down over the top of your right corner of your browser and selecting gallery as opposed to speaker view. You also may want to click view options so Michael and I appear side by side. We will be going back and forth between slides and just the sort of like the talking heads, if you will. So you'll see your screen somewhat dynamic, but if you keep it side by side, it's usually a fairly seamless experience. So our topics for today are updates on this year's waitlist, changes to deferral policies, aid packages for current seniors, fall testing and test optional schools, latest on school openings, and then what should current juniors be doing. And again, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A panel. However, if you have a question that maybe requires a bit more nuance, or you want to connect with one of us, or maybe have a private question, you're welcome to reach out to either Michael or me or anyone on our respective teams for help. So with that, here we go. But Michael, before we dive into the agenda, a quick update on the updates. Michael, I turned on CNN this morning. What did I see?
Unbelievable. Yeah, Chris.
Unbelievable.
I reached out to you as soon as I saw it this morning. I mean, the Cal State system, which is a system of approximately 500,000 students, has announced that they are not going to open for on-campus learning. So a group of schools of that magnitude, that's amazing. But what CNN was saying also is, don't be surprised if the UCal system follows up on this as well. So once we see that happening, now we're talking about a network of over 800,000 students who study in the state of California. And that doesn't even touch upon the private schools in California that may be impacted by this as well. If Los Angeles doesn't open up, what does that mean for Southern Cal, for USC? I'm sorry, yeah, for Southern Cal, for USC. If it continues for the whole state, what does it mean for Stanford? What does it mean for the Claremont McKenna group? I mean, clearly, there are incredible impacts in terms of this. And we're going to talk more about this later, but I think part of it is we're going to have to look at what parts of the country feel like they can open versus what parts of the country don't believe that they can.
And just to sort of like epitomize what's going on right now with this question as of this morning, funny enough, I have a student in New York City who, as of right now, he's deposited at Claremont McKenna. He's actively trying to get off the waitlist at UC Berkeley and Dartmouth. And now that this news has come out, if the UC system also doesn't do in-person classes in the fall, and for whatever reason Claremont McKenna, decides to change its policy or to also institute a similar policy, where does he end up? Right? Where's he going to go? Because this is someone who wants to go to school next fall, and right now he's on the Dartmouth waiting list. So what does he do? You go to Stony Brook? Fascinating. All right, so Michael, here we go. Let's get into it. So updates on this year's wait list. What are you hearing, Michael?
I think what was interesting to me was it was very obvious that some schools didn't wait till May 1st. They started right away. Chicago, I had a student accepted at Chicago in the second week of May. We're seeing a lot of action. Stanford actually did a little bit on their wait list prior to May 1st. Wash U, some very top schools are going forward, into Cornell have gone forward prior to May 1 And I think then they regrouped on May 1 to see where they were. Some schools have gone to a second and even a third wave of going to their wait list. I think colleges are panicked. Colleges are concerned who's really going to come. The whole question of schools that have a large number of international students are really worried about what's going to happen with those situations in terms of that. I think a kid who's on the wait list right now who initially deposited at UCLA or Berkeley might want to revisit that right now if they're still sitting on a wait list somewhere. I mean, there needs to be some real thought in terms of what's going on. But yes, this is unprecedented. I don't think we've ever seen this kind of action on the wait list this early and continuing to be ongoing.
Now, Michael, one of the things that I've heard with respect to this question is that there are some students who are, on the wait list, right? But I hear that some schools are taking new applications despite students being on the wait list. What are you hearing about that?
I think I heard one story the other day that was amazing to me. A student is sitting on a wait list and it's out there that the college is taking applications. Boy, I'd be
Crazy.
offended if I was that student of what the hell's going on. I'd get on the phone, call the school and say, exactly that. I just saw you're taking new applications. I'm on your wait list. What's going on? But yeah, I think it's really frightening in terms of where schools are at in terms of this. And this is going to be a summer-long process. This is not going to be your typical, oh, it's almost the end of June, things are settled, et cetera. There are going to be kids making decisions as schools make decisions. The more schools that start to decide we're only going to do online teaching or we're not going to open in the fall is going to impact the decision of kids reaching out to colleges and say, do you still have room for me? So I think we're looking at things that we have just never, ever seen before.
Literally, I mean, funny enough, I'll talk a few minutes about a student of mine who dropped out of an Ivy League school, who heard some interesting news today about her application status at a different college, and I'll talk about that in a second. But there's also a question that came in the registration forms, which is, my child was waitlisted at 2 colleges. She got into one and she hasn't heard back from the other. Should she follow up? What would you recommend, Michael?
Well, there's 2 parts to that. Number one, I'm assuming the first school that took her off the wait list is asking for a commitment and a deposit from the family. And that family can't wait for the second school, okay? In other words, if the school is saying to you, we want an answer now, you go ahead and give them an answer. If then they go to the wait list at the second school, she should reach out, no question about it. She should reach out to the second school to ask what's going on. They may not be able to give her an answer, or they may say, we don't know right now, but we're happy to stay in touch with you as long as you're still interested. It may mean you lose a deposit later on if you get into the other school that you'd rather go to. But yes, being proactive right now in this crazy world totally makes sense.
Got it. So just in terms of other actions, or what should people be doing if they're currently on the wait list? Anything else in addition to what we've already said?
Well, I think they want to find out and stay in touch. I mean, the schools that are doing a good job and being in touch with families, both of returning students and incoming students, that gives you a message of what's going on. If that school is staying in touch, keeping you posted of what they see happening, that's a great sign in terms of that. But I think we could be looking at a situation, and you and I talked about this the other day, that you could get to August and all of a sudden find out a school says, we're going to go online, or we're not even going to open until October, November, or second semester. I think a student's going to have to make some hard decisions at that time. And I think the one thing that you and I talked about is student may decide, may not, the school's not going to defer them at that point. They're not going to let them take a gap year at that point. Student may just decide, I'm not going to college right now. In other words, and this is the sad news for the junior families that are listening, that kid can just drop out of that school and reapply to the other 3,000 schools in America next year, just like every kid that's a junior currently, and apply as a freshman for the following year. And I don't blame families for doing that. I mean, I think in this, the sphere of the unknown, and you doctorated the gap, you're not, in terms of the deposits. And I think you're going to talk a little bit about the whole concept of maybe a gap year isn't the greatest idea right now either. I think the reality is you're going to have to make some hard decisions, but it could make the pool even that much more difficult for juniors sitting out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. One of the things that I see as an opportunity for students who do choose to not go to school next year is, for those who are particularly interested in business, is this idea of entrepreneurship. Has there ever been a time where things have been more volatile? There's so much opportunity right now, right? We're seeing market dynamics in a really kind of fascinating way. We're seeing consumer behavior in a really fascinating way. And for people who are interested one day in developing their own venture, this could actually be the time to sink their teeth into that or experiment with that, because things are so kind of up in the air and shaky, but also ripe for opportunity.
Last night on the ABC News, they were showing a group of students that have started to connect with farmers that were throwing milk away, throwing vegetables away, and setting up a whole enterprise to get trucks to bring them to food kitchens. And
Amazing.
it's amazing. And be able to talk about that a year from now in the college process, they decide not to go to college and they do that for the year, or a student who's currently a high school student. Incredible. I mean, certainly a great opportunity for students to think about that as well.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Next we have changes to deferral policies. Just so everybody's, aware, what does it mean to be deferred? Deferred is when you've been accepted to the school and you've decided to defer a year. So you write a letter to the school and you ask, hey, you know what? Love the school. Thank you so much. But I actually want to start next year. I'll put my deposit in. Can I hold my place? Typically, that's been, a fairly straightforward process. Not so much right now, Michael.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think for kids who got their, decisions in regular process, reached out to schools and did the normal kind of mechanism that schools normally would ask you to do, schools were okay initially. They're very clear right now. We saw it in a letter that you received from, I think we can mention school in New Hampshire that basically said, if we take you off the wait list, you must come, okay?
Right.
And I think that schools that are now going to their wait list are doing it to fill their class. They're not doing it to give you an option of, oh, will you go to college next year or not? They're doing it to fill their class. And that's a policy that's a little more strict than in the past. I also think, and something, Chris, you talked about, and you can talk more about this, is what are you really going to do if you take a gap year? Unless you're that business entrepreneur you just thought about, there's no Peace Corps anymore. There's no, USA Corps America. Things that existed in the past for kids to do in their gap year certainly can't travel abroad. What are the things that they're going to do? And a college may say, okay, you want to take a gap year? What are you planning on doing? And there's difference between saying, I want to defer or I want to take a gap year. Want to defer? You may not need to say so much of what you want to do. If you want to take a gap year, the college may say, what are you planning on doing?
Right. And one of the things too that I've been telling my students is, there's that Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, right? I'm calling it the Ajemian principle, the 80-120 rule. I think that right now, right, in the fall, particularly for the applicants, right? So juniors are going to be applicants in the fall. You're probably going to be competing with a pool that's really 80% of what it normally is. And if you decide to not go to college for a year and decide not to apply for a year, you're going to probably be dealing with about 120% of the competition. I think that also holds true for students who are current college graduates, right? They may want to defer a year and finish a year later, okay? Or, take like a leave of absence because of what's going on with COVID-19. But, same thing with the job market, right? The job market is going to come back at some point. I think getting yourself through school and into the job market as soon as possible is only going to help you.
I mean, I've become a huge fan of CNN today. Obviously I was watching this morning, listening to the whole California system.
The coverage has been amazing, nonstop.
And then at noontime, they actually had the president of Oakland University in Michigan come on. And she basically said, I don't think kids should be thinking about taking a gap year. They should be thinking about taking advantage of what they're being offered right now. And I think a lot of schools are going to be creative. The word I keep hearing is hybrid. Hybrid is going to be a combination that you might have a lecture class where the lecture class is taught online, but then you get into a smaller discussion section with a smaller group of students that's face-to-face. And so colleges are going to start to be more creative in terms of what they can do. So the colleges that decide to move forward are going to really think about safety. They're going to think about what can they do in the terms of these situations. One word we haven't come up with today is testing. My God, what a college can do in terms of testing. And that's what the president at Oakland said. We're going to set up a system to make sure we can test our students, that we're on top of our students. And the more colleges that can do that, the more likely there are to open. Think about a college. I'll use Emory as an example. It's one of my favorite schools. But think about a college that has a great medical school right on campus. There's a perfect opportunity for that university to open, knowing that there's a testing system in place. They can be on top of it.
Point.
A more remote college without that opportunity, it might be more difficult for them to think about opening.
Right. And I'll add one more thing too. And this is obviously for students who are in college. I'm advising, our college students right now to be looking at fifth year master's programs. There are universities out there that have extremely generous, I'll put it that way, extremely generous criteria for their own students continuing their education at their school and getting, say, either an MA, an MS, or even in some cases an MBA, right? And so I'm always saying to students, as you're thinking about what the process is looking like coming out of school, you actually may want to stay in school because, again, the 80-20 rule, okay, or the 120 rule. If you want to stay out of a highly competitive job market, right? But if when you enter the job market, you're coming not just with your BA or your BS, but also your MA, MS, EDM, you name it, MBA, you're gonna be that much more at an advantage.
And let's also remember that graduate classes are normally smaller. So they're going to be classes where you're probably more likely to be able to have in-class kinds of sessions as well too.
Yeah,
and I shared the story with you yesterday. One of my best friends who has a hedge fund in New York says that he loves a kid who's an engineer, but then goes out and gets an MBA. So for some of you engineers out there, what a great idea. Take your fifth year and go get an MBA, and then maybe you can get a great job somewhere in business as opposed to just being limited to engineering as well.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So deferral policies, there you go. So Michael, next on the tab here is current seniors and their financial aid packages. So Michael, what are you hearing with this?
This is probably not going to sit well with some of the senior parents out there, but I think a lot of parents are getting bad advice. Let's think about it from the college point of view. If you're a fairly wealthy family and you got into a very good school and you decide that you're going to play games with a financial aid office because one of you has been furloughed for 2 months and you think that's going to impact your financial situation in terms of what a college can do, and you're living in $1 million home, I don't think you're going to get a lot of sympathy from those universities.
Probably not.
Okay? There's a difference between you're being furloughed for 2 months and you're going to return to your job, or you're going to lose your job. And I think if you look at all the current information that's out there, unfortunately, it's families that don't have high incomes that are in the group that are losing jobs. And in those situations, then I think you can talk to the college. Then I think you're in a situation to say, here's my aid package. I know we had an expected family contribution of so many dollars. We're not going to be able to do that. A couple schools that I've talked to have said, we're not sure we're going to change a package for September, but we may revisit it and change the package for January, because then you're going to have a better sense. You're going to have a better sense of what's the long-term impact for a family as opposed to the 2-month, 3-month impact, okay? So I think that's really important in terms of that. So I think families that try to just play the game as opposed to real hardship are two very different cases. And I think colleges are sensitive to families that are going through real hardship. And I think you know who you are in those situations.
Well, so here's a question for you. I was on the internet and I saw that Penn State and William & Mary they've announced in-state tuition fees are being frozen, right? For this upcoming year. And I know that Dean Ryan from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who's now the president of University of Virginia, was also on television recently talking about.
It was on CBS on Sunday. Yes. Yep.
Okay, great. What are you hearing about tuition freezes and how that might be affecting, so like the aid sort of landscape where students are actually choosing to maybe stay in state because
I think we talked about this in the last session. And I think it's even more prevalent right now. Is a student going to be more inclined to stay closer to home or to go to an in-state university where the tuition is going to be less and then apply as a transfer a year from now? I mean, think of it this way. If I'm a school that's allowing a number of schools to defer and to gap, I'm going to have a lot of room for sophomores. I may not have room for freshmen, but I'm going to have room for sophomores because I may end up with a smaller freshman class this year and have spaces next year for kids who might transfer in from another university. So I think that it's not a bad decision for a family to think about doing that. The difference, though, is there are families that are calling universities and threatening to say, well, I'll just send my child to a junior college, or a community college for a semester, and then we'll come next semester. And I don't think a university is going to be very favorable to those situations. And I think it also is going to be one of those situations where don't expect there to be a space for you a year from now at that university if you decide to take that option. I think for many families, many students, and you and I have talked about this, Chris, who are honored and flattered and happy that they were accepted into a great school. And if that means they may have to do something for the first semester of 8 semesters that isn't as comfortable as it might have been doing all the normal things that we traditionally know about, boy, it would be nice to maybe have to decide to suck it up for one semester, knowing that you're going to eventually graduate from an incredible university with a degree that will mean something later on in life.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that, because one of the things that I've been sort of like considering during this time is just how much short-term thinking is going on. I mean, it makes sense. It's sort of human nature. I'm looking at it more from a much more long-term perspective. What's the right decision, now for, 15 years from now, right? Again, get yourself through school, right? Get yourself into the job market as early as possible, right? I'll be kind of curious to see what the data looks like in maybe say 10 years about students who enter the job market, right at the start of all this, whereas people who sort of like delayed their education, what's going to happen as far as earnings go, career trajectories go. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something significant in that information.
I mean, think of the example NYU. It's a school that has been honest with families that they are need aware, that they basically cannot meet 100% of need of every student that applies. But there are many families that they're accepted to NYU and they figure out how to pay for it. Okay.
Right.
And I think we're in that situation right now.
Make it work. You find a way to make it work.
They decide to make it work, because it's that important to them to have their child to go to the Stern School of Business at NYU, but it might cost them a little bit more than going to a state university. So I think families have to step back and say, all right, let's look at our big situation, the big picture. And I love what you just said. This is not a short-term, 1 semester, 3-month decision. This is a lifetime decision. And again, as I said before, the next 7 semesters for these kids are probably going to be okay. We're talking about what's going to happen this coming semester and decide how that will impact what you decide to do for something that could be a benefit for you for the rest of your life.
And let me add to, while information hasn't been released yet, but if looking at tuition freezes, there are some schools that might do something on the financials. So in the end, it's like it might be a net gain for you as far as finances go, because this upcoming semester may be less expensive for one reason or another than it typically would have been. So even though
the net gain may factor, Chris, the net gain may factor after these 4 years. Having a degree from a school that's very well respected, your net gain over the rest of your lifetime may be very, very much impacted by the fact that you made that decision that, getting through this first semester and staying with the school that I love and want to be at is where I want to be.
Right. So, Michael, what should people be doing then as far as financial aid goes? What are you recommending?
I think, back to the example I used before, if there's a genuine hardship, you should be reaching out to financial aid offices and let them know that. If you know you've lost your job and there's no chance that this job is coming back, that's very different than a furlough. So I think if you're in a situation like that, and you're not going to have the resource, certainly you can visit that. But as I said, I've talked to 2 schools who've said to me, we hear what families are saying, we'll revisit it in January. So I think you should at least reach out, develop a contact, make a case, because you want to at least have a record. The fact that you reached out now and said, we're going through a hardship, even if the college doesn't decide to do something right away, you've at least started the conversation. And that means when you come back to them in November to get ready for second semester, you might say to them, things haven't gotten better, they've actually gotten far worse. And then the college already has a record of the fact you've been in contact and more of a reason to be proactive perhaps for that second semester.
Got it. So let's move along here. Okay, so that's 8 packages. Thanks so much for that. So updates on fall testing and test optional schools. So, this is a topic that's sort of near and dear to my heart because I enjoy the testing so much. But also want to kind of get your perspective on this, Michael. But, The truth of the matter is this, is that really nothing's changed, right? We're sort of at status quo. APs have started. It's been a bit of a disaster,
Absolutely.
right? We're talking about this at our staff meeting earlier today. There's been computer glitches. There's been delivery glitches. There's been cheating going on. It's all the same stuff, right?
The credibility of the credibility of AP tests helping a student in the admissions process who's currently a junior, to me, is basically not going to be worth much of anything. Okay, the fact that you actually took the classes during the school year will be more of value than anything that you show on the test. Okay, so you haven't wasted the year taking the AP class because you've challenged yourself in a more challenging curriculum, which we've always said colleges want to see. The significance of the actual score on the AP test now, however, will lose much of its credibility.
Totally, especially amidst all the sort of the chaos and commotion that's going on right now with the testing experience, which I have to say I'm a bit surprised by, because College Board, is the administrator of the SAT and the APs, and those exams are created really by Educational Testing Service. And ETS is also the company that does the GRE, and they've been delivering exams online for a while. Computer-based testing, and they have protocols in place, and so I've been surprised. If anything, that's different with respect to testing.
But this is a great example of someone who wasn't ready. They weren't ready to how to deal with this and how it was going to impact them. And again, people that have done what they need to do. You and I have discussed the TOEFL exam for international students. It's an online test with a human component in it, but that's working. That's ongoing. For an international kid, they better have a TOEFL score, even at schools that are test optional now.
Right, or a Duolingo score, and the Duolingo online experience is actually quite positive. But as far as SAT and ACT go, for those who are interested in knowing more about it, as of right now, the June ACT has not been canceled. Right, that's the next sort of official sort of like reasoning or like entrance exam that's going to be offered to students. And I think it's funny, the more and more they haven't canceled the test with every passing day, I think they're actually going to probably keep the test. Mm-hmm. What it looks like, I don't know. Could it be canceled? It could be. But as of right now, it seems like the June ACTs are happening. Now, that said, it could also be state specific, right? Looking at what might be happening and say, in New York City, are they going to be doing it? I mean, I'm highly skeptical of that.
Exactly.
In Texas, I'm highly confident that it will happen. Okay. But then as far as the College Board goes and the SAT, as of right now, it's still the same. The next official test date is going to be at the end of August, and then they're going to have exams for every month of the fall. So it'll be August, September, October, November, and December. So there'll be plenty of chances to take the exams. And ACT has also kept its exam schedule as well. And as of right now, those exam dates are, they're going to be run as they were supposed to be run. So either at a testing center and done on paper, or in the ACT's case, at a testing center and done on the computer. Could it change? It could. I'm thinking too, Michael, that especially given all the flack the College Board is getting right now with the APs, that they're going to do everything they can to make sure they can deliver paper tests in the fall. Thoughts, Michael?
No question. I think the other thing that's important, we can talk about examples of schools in a few minutes. The fact that some schools are talking about going test optional for this coming year, but if you're living somewhere where there's no hardship to take the test, and you can take the test, and you're coming from a New York private school, for example, it's going to be very surprising to a university that you didn't take the test, okay? Right. So I think that, a school like Cornell has been talking about going test optional for this coming year in certain schools of the university. At the same time, they've been very clear that if you can take the test, okay? And Harvard is very much the same way. If there's hardship to take the test, we will consider your application without the tests. For a New York private school kid, there's no hardship to take the test. There will be places to take the test before this year is over. So I think I had a family ask me the other day, they took it early, they scored 1490, Cornell is going to be test optional, what should we share the score? Of course you should share the score.
Of course you should share the score.
Okay, no question about it. It's going to give you an advantage versus a similar kid with a similar transcript with no test score. So I'm sorry, I'm a skeptic in terms of all these schools that are saying we're going to go test optional. There's been years for athletes, I've talked about this before, where schools that are test optional still nicely behind the table say, oh, by the way, could you share what you got on your testing as well too?
Right.
Okay, so true test option, a Wake Forest, for example, that is truly test optional and has been test optional before this, fine. But these schools that are saying, for this 1 year, we're going to do it, I would be a little cautious in terms of, taking advantage of the fact that of not taking the test when you very much know you can take the test.
Right. Just to kind of make sure that, we're clear with the audience. So when we're talking about Cornell and Harvard going or putting test optional policies in place for this coming year, Cornell has said that they will be allowing students who are under-resourced and who do not have access to testing, they don't have to submit the SAT or the ACT, right? Harvard is not saying that. Harvard wants the SAT and ACT, of course, to look at it in context, but where they're going, quote unquote, test optional is really on subject tests. Okay. Now, what's funny about that is that Harvard's actually been doing that for years. So, for example, with international students who might be in an IB curriculum or in the UK who are in an A-level curriculum, if you're not taking classes in these subjects that are tested on the SAT subject tests, that's where the exception comes into play, right? And they've been doing that for years, Harvard has. For this year.
But Chris, I'll add a funny story to that, though. The dean at Harvard once shared with me about a kid in China who isn't taking any AP classes or taking any courses that correlate with subject tests, that submitted 6 AP tests and submitted 6 subject scores because they thought that would impress them with the fact that they did that, even though they haven't taken the actual courses. That's why there's such ludicrous nonsense about AP. That's why, Chris, I'm not a fan of subject tests or AP tests in that respect. But I think one thing that I will say, and I've said this before, if you're an international student who can't get access to a test center to take the SAT or the ACT, you darn well better take that TOEFL or your Duolingo class.
Hey, Michael, I want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit more about the hiring freezes and how they might be affecting really testing and also highlighting the need for testing. You want to talk a little bit more about the hiring freezes that I know that you're sort of in the know on this?
Yeah, I've talked to a number of universities in the last couple of weeks to find out kind of what's going on. And, there's hiring freezes across the country. And why should you be allowed to hire an admissions person versus a professor? So you're in a situation where a lot of offices are going to get tighter as it is. And we talk about the California system. And, it's interesting. Janet Neapolitano, incredible woman who runs the UCal system, pushed a couple of years ago to get SAT and ACT to be optional. She was overruled by her faculty who saw value in the ACT and the SAT. This year, the UCal system has said they will be test optional. I still think a kid who has a score is going to have an advantage in the admissions process if they submit it. No reason not to do that if you're thinking about applying to a UCal. She's proposing now to continue with this after this year. She's saying that without having discussed it with her faculty yet. I will be very surprised if the situation in California is more than a 1-year situation, or, as she has said, they will develop an alternative test to parallel the SAT or the ACT that they'll ask UCal kids to do. They already have their own application. They already have their own essays. Why shouldn't they have their own test? But something will come into place. But the problem is in the Cal system, you're sitting with 110,000 applications, and a kid who has a test score gets a way to differentiate themselves from somebody else who doesn't have a test score. So I think
I had that exact conversation. I'm part of the IACAC, International Association of College Admissions Counselors. And, I was in the Shanghai conference a couple of years ago, and I met one of the admissions people from UCLA, and he gave me that exact number. He's like, we have over 100,000 applications every single year. He's like, we need test scores because we don't have the staffing to do it. And so now with the hiring freezes that you're talking about, I'm really wondering if it's going to really just even highlight the importance of having tests just from a practical standpoint.
I think it highlights that. It also bothers me because the California system puts such a premium on GPAs, and schools that have inflated grades, a student there who doesn't have a test score is going to be at a disadvantage versus a kid who's coming from an inflated GPA school when the California system tries to throw them all into their computer system to funnel down what the applicant pool is going to look like. Yeah, it's a concern.
So I think the summary point here, Michael, is that, it's take the test. If you can take the test, take the test. It's going to be an advantage. Obviously with all the uncertainty going on right now, I think the more you can give admissions offices exactly what they're used to seeing, there's going to be a level of comfort, a sense of comfort, less of the unknown. And if, admissions is about anything, it's about removing uncertainty about the applicant's credentials and their ability to contribute to your campus.
The only thing I would add to that, Chris, though, is if it comes to the fall and, there's all these warnings about a second wave, things that could happen. And if all of a sudden there is no SAT in October, November, and December, then I think the lack of testing will be more taken into account in terms of those situations. If we return more to normalcy in the next few months, then I think, as you said, you should take the test. Yes.
So let's take a look now at our next topic here. So that's fall testing and test optional schools. This might be our meatiest topic yet, at least for today's talk. Michael, what are we hearing about school openings?
I think one of the things that I've heard that's coming through loud and clear, and the California decision today is testament to it, is sadly, a lot of what happens this fall may be based on the politics of that particular state. In other words, a red state, which has a governor who's much more inclined to open restaurants and get people out there and move forward, will say we should open our universities. A blue state, a state like New York, state now like California, may be a little more conservative in terms of how quickly they want to put a lot of students in one location and have a caution that way. If Mayor de Blasio in New York basically says, we're not going to open the schools in September, he's not going to say to NYU and Fordham and Columbia and Barnard, oh no, that's fine, you go ahead and open. Absolutely. No, there's going to be some real concerns in terms of that situation if they're still banning large groups getting together. So for example, a great example I would use, state of Georgia right now, okay? As red as they come with a crazy governor, no offense. Well, yeah, offense given. But anyways, if I'm a private university in the state of Georgia like Emory, and the University of Georgia is opening, and Georgia Tech is opening, I may feel an obligation that I have to figure out a way to open my school. University of Miami has already said, we're going to open with testing because they know their governor is going to open the University of Florida.
And when you say with testing, you mean with COVID-19 testing?
COVID-19 testing, exactly. I think that's back to when we talk about, you like to talk about SAT testing. Testing for me is COVID-19 testing, okay? The state of Texas, if Texas Austin opens and Texas A&M opens, if I'm Rice or if I'm SMU, I got to open. I can't explain why I'm not opening if these other schools are opening. So I think, again, what universities put in place for testing, for protecting students, for having hybrid courses that allow students to do as much as they possibly can, the better. The woman from Oakland today who was talking about her kids coming to campus really had said, I want our kids to still have a college experience. It may not be exactly what you're used to, but I still want to have a homecoming. I still want to be able to have opportunities for kids to interact with other students. So I think the colleges that do open are thinking of ways of doing it. But there's going to be so many different models out there, it's going to be crazy. We used the example before, the large lecture hall is not going to happen anymore. That could be done online. Discussion groups of that class can then be in smaller sessions. I think liberal arts colleges may benefit by this. Smaller liberal arts colleges that have traditionally smaller classes probably already have in place the mechanism to do this. But the woman from Oakland said, the lecture hall that I used to have 120 students in, I might have 40 students in. Colleges are going to have to be creative. The more creative they are, the more likely they are to open.
I think it's so interesting, Michael. We sort of touched upon this earlier, just the politics involved in this and how politics are influencing this landscape and the choices that people, in New Jersey might be making. Blue state, red state. Red states are saying public institutions open up, right? And then what do the private institutions do? And then you have, blue states are saying no. There may be taking a different sort of tact. Maybe there's some dialogue going on between the state office and then the sort of like the regents of the public university system. And like for example in California, the public institutions like Cal State or maybe even UC now, they may actually be going online and not opening in the fall. And what does that do to the private institutions? So like this red state, blue state public-private dynamic is really kind of fascinating.
But, the president at Brown came out a month ago and said, we realize we need to open in some capacity.
Yeah.
And I think that's the message, in terms of any dean that I've talked to recently, they are saying, unless our state forbids it, we need to open in some way so that students can have at least some kind of an on-campus experience. And it's our job to figure out what that's going to be. It may mean we don't have college football this fall, or we have college football without spectators. I mean, there has to be discussions at different universities of what works and what works, but what doesn't work. But I think what's really important is colleges who open in some way are at an advantage versus schools who decide to do everything online. No question about that.
Right. And one thing too, this is sort of funny, and I'm not sure if I've talked about this in previous sessions together, but, I live, in Maine, and it's where everybody comes for summer camp. And a lot of my New York City friends and sort of colleagues who bring their kids up here for summer camp have been asking me for the inside information on what Governor Mills is going to do as far as reopening the state, closing the state, et cetera. And as of right now, through the end of August, if you cross that state line and come into Maine, whether you're a resident or you're a visitor, you must quarantine for 14 days. Yep. That's through the end of August, yep. Michael. Usually freshmen come in mid-August, end of August. So I'm kind of wondering, what plans in place?
I've talked with a couple deans, and I've said to them, you guys have to think about setting up your own quarantine mechanism.
Literally, right?
Yep. We think it's only international kids, but it could be state rules. I mean, for an international kid currently coming from China or Spain or Italy, where we've had, extensive COVID-19, those kids would have to at least have a 14-day quarantine if it's allowed. The university is going to need to set up a mechanism. God, think about Maine. If I'm Bates, Colby, or Bowdoin, what am I going to do about kids that are coming in from anywhere else in the country? I better have some capacity put in place on my campus, or hopefully the governor may make an exception for those kinds of situations. But they're going to have to make some hard decisions. But the irony of making that exception, think about this. Late August is a great vacation time for people who want to come to Maine. So all of a sudden, if I want to sit on the beach at Ogunquit during those last 2 weeks of August, because the governor is relaxing this for the kids that want to go to college at Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, I don't know. I'm not sure she's going to do that, So I think the colleges have to put something in place to be ready to deal with it. It's like, I think you used the example the other day. What are the parents going to do? Dump their kids at some Walmart in parking lot in New Hampshire and have a bus ready to take them up to one of those 3 schools to then go into a 14-day quarantine? Because the parents can't go into the state and check into a hotel while their kid goes off to college.
So dropping your kid off, which is like, it's talk about a rite of passage or like a seminal moment in one's life. Dropping your kid off at college for the first time may not happen this year. You might be dropping them off in a parking lot. It's kind of like that shuttle bus that runs between like Long Island and Cornell. Mm-hmm. You bring your kid to the parking lot and they get on the bus and they go up there. I kind of wonder if that's going to be a strategy that some schools use.
And I worry about those 3 schools in Maine in particular, because let's use the example of Dartmouth. Dartmouth is remote like those 3 schools are, but Dartmouth has a medical school on campus. New Hampshire doesn't have those restrictions in place.
Well, we got Maine Medical. Maine Medical literally saved my life. So.
In Portland, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but they'd have to create a relationship, a little easier for Bates and Bowdoin because they're closer to Portland than Colby is, but in a situation where they have to think about what are they going to be able to put in place, which a college, like I say, that has a medical program nearby probably can do more of the testing necessary for them to open. And I think colleges that are thinking ahead and doing these kinds of things are way ahead of the curve in terms of being able to open in the fall.
So, Michael, sort of final point on this. Did I see that the Ivy League announced that they're going to sort of collectively announce their plans for the fall, July 1st? Did I see something like that?
Well, you'll laugh when I say this, but let's remember that the Ivy League was started as a football league. Okay. In other words,
Boston College, my alma mater, was invited. We said no, but we were invited.
These 8 schools decided to come together for the sake of athletics. Okay. But because of that, they've created that bond where they do have many discussions of what they unilaterally will do. Okay.
Right.
What could impact that, however, is what's going to happen to a Columbia. You know,
Sure. Columbia versus Dartmouth, two completely different
if
situations.
the rules of New York City are totally different than for the other 7 campuses, are the other 7 schools not going to open because Columbia can't open? No, of course they're going to open. So I think it's going to still be impacted by what's going on in a particular state and in terms of what the state is allowing to go on in those particular situations. But you're right. There will be a discussion among the 8 Ivy League schools of what is everybody else doing. No question about that.
Yeah. Right. And just sort of the final point on this before we get to impact on juniors is that, if you have a student who's a senior right now or even a junior right now, it probably makes more sense to be looking at the state politics as opposed to federal politics, because it's going state by state by state. And so what happens from Washington, D.C. may not necessarily matter as much unless Trump makes some sort of unilateral decision for the country. You really want to start to track your state government's sort of messaging and their announcements, because at the end of the day, as of right now, that they seem to be the ones who are making the decisions in some cases where your student may go to college next year.
What I would add to that, though, is it's very clear with the tension that currently is going on between the US and China that you could see Trump go out there and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to issue visas to students from China. The only thing that I would say about that is we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry of Chinese students coming to the United States. And Trump, being the businessman that he is, I'm not so sure that he would make a unilateral decision like that. But we never know, who knows?
We never know. If nothing else, predictably unpredictable, right?
Yes, that is correct.
So school openings, and now probably what most people on the call are interested in learning is, what are our suggestions for current juniors? A lot going on, Michael. Thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the questions we had from a parent today was, will there be early decision next year? I'm believing that universities are going to try to be as consistent as they have in the past in terms of admissions practices. A few things are going to change. I don't think admission officers are going to get out on the road in the fall to do college fairs. I don't think they're going to do school visits like they used to do. So I think there's going to be a lot more in-house situations. So in terms of, say, a college admission person might do a Zoom session with a high school, and in that room might be 10 or 12 students interested in that school who have an interaction with that admission person, which used to be in person at the school. That's a change. I think schools, and I've heard a lot of schools saying this, they've got to get their campus open. And when we talked last session about demonstrated interest, as you're reaching out, if a university is opening up for students to come and visit, you better get up and visit. No question about that. I think ED will happen. I think early decision is going to happen. And I think for a junior, with this admission market going to get very tight next year, I think going early decision at a school that you can realistically get into is a wise decision to think about. I think
if you think about the 80-120 rule I was talking about earlier, the Ajemian principle, applying ED in a pool that's 80% as competitive as it normally would be, that's a huge advantage.
Huge advantage. And remember the difference between ED and EA.
Right.
Okay? All right. I think you're going to be at a huge advantage thinking about going ED to a school early as opposed to EA. For an EA situation, there's no advantage for a school to take a lot of kids EA because they want to make sure they're figuring out how to really fill their class. EA is being nice. ED is filling up your class.
Hey, here's a question. This kind of just occurred to me. I've seen schools change their ED, EA, ED2 policies from year to year. Might some schools actually implement early decision for the first time?
I think there's no question that school, we've watched the last couple of years where Chicago and Tulane are great examples that added ED to their EA programs.
Yeah.
They are much kinder to their ED applicants than they are to their EA applicants. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. A school that may already have EA may add ED. Your old school, Boston College, has now added ED last year.
Grant Goslin, a classmate, friend, great guy.
Yeah. So we're in a situation where they've realized there's value there. To see more schools doing that, wouldn't be surprised at all. Yeah.
No. So we're basically saying here, if there's any opportunity for you to visit a school, visit a campus, you absolutely 125% should do it, because that is as perfect an illustration of demonstrated interest as there can be. And if not,
the greatest example of demonstrated interest is applying ED.
Sure, excellent
Okay,
point.
you can't top that. Okay, right. Okay, yes. But we talked the last time about a lot about what can you do to demonstrate interest, because there's programs out there that like Slate, or they're picking up that kids are in contact with schools. Now go a step further if you have that opportunity. No question about it. Yeah.
Right. And then also, one last sort of recommendation here. I love this thing that we've talked about in the past, which is the idea of getting recommendations from teachers who have really seen you shine during this particular process, right? And why is that? This might happen again.
You're
right? And if you have a teacher who says that you are, an amazing student through and through, and whether classes are all live or they're hybrid or blended, whatever term you want to use, I think that's going to be really attractive to colleges this fall, because as of now, the world has changed. The education market has changed forever, because this is now a reality, and this could happen again. And schools have to have a plan in place for this type of support, this type of learning. I know even Harvard last year, when I was doing my master's there, they piloted a program over the summer called How People Learn, and it was an online learning program. And then they actually implemented it this year for this last 2019-2020 class as a formal piece of their of the experience. The education school at Harvard, they've been able to maintain and continue, delivering great education because they had these pieces in place. And so I think students who can thrive, whether it's in an online environment, offline environment, is going to be very, very interesting. And your teachers right now are the ones who can say for sure, how you sort of, work within that context. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no, question. There's a reality, and there's a chance that this could come back again. And students who have been able to thrive in this situation, or as you and I talked last time, in terms of extracurriculars that have gone out of their way to do something during this period of time to help people in the community, to show proactive initiative of what's going on, that will be something that will be absolutely critical. I want to add one more thing to this. I know we're getting close to closing and opening up for some questions, but I also want us to make a message. If you're a sophomore out there right now, pay attention to what's going on. Because what could happen is, if a significant number of kids defer this coming year for the class for this coming fall and fall back into the pool for the following year, there's no reason that a lot of kids next year might not do the same thing.
Oh, brilliant.
So we could be in a situation where, for a family who has a sophomore right now, they need to be sensitive to watch what's going on over the next year. I really urge, make sure you're working with somebody really good at your school or outside who is paying attention to what's going on, because that's really critical for families right now to understand this process.
And that's really where our conversations a few weeks ago started, this idea of the trickle-down effect, right? That's the ultimate trickle-down.
Yep.
All right, so Michael, Q&A, we've hit on a lot of the questions that kind of came in. I'm going to take a few here from the registration. We also have a couple in the Q&A panel. And again, if anyone has any questions right now, please put them in the Q&A panel. We will get to them. So Michael, a question here on deferrals and gap year. Will admissions be more selective if a large number of students opt to defer or take a gap year? What amount could impact that? Is there like a number? I don't
think there's a number, but I think a lot of it is, if you can get a sense of how many kids a school was able to defer or allow to take a gap year, who are going to come in the following year, and reduce the number of spaces that a college is going to have for freshmen coming out that are current juniors and applying, that's going to impact. There's no question colleges will be more selective. They're going to be more selective because they're going to be looking at filling a class with fewer spaces. And that's going to be reality. No matter what happens right now in terms of defers, gaps, or kids who decide not to come, it's going to be much more selective next year for someone who's a junior. I'm sorry, that's, it's the reality of our times, and I know I'm going to have a conversation with a family tonight that we've already started to have this conversation. It's a junior. What are we going to do in terms of thinking ahead in terms of this piece? She may be someone who decides to take a gap year. And then she goes back into that pool of all those poor sophomores we're talking about right now, because she'll take a space at a school that those sophomores are applying for. So I think that this is an ongoing process. Yes, schools will be more selective this fall, no question. But we don't know the numbers yet until we see what schools do.
Right. So, one of the questions that kind of came in, this is a bit of a sidebar to what we've been talking about. Any insight to the prep school situation? Anything new on that, Michael, as far as how, I say prep school, I figure like boarding schools?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, is a student who decides to do a PG year right now, coming out of high school, or even next year, a junior coming out of.
Can you explain what a PG is, just for people who may not?
Postgraduate year, where many of the top high, Exeter, Andover, Lawrenceville, these are schools that have what's called a postgraduate year, a fifth year senior that come back and do an extra year. So back to talking about there's nothing to do in your gap year, perhaps a PG year is not such a bad idea. So I think that you might see greater business at some of these prep schools who have fifth year programs, because here's an opportunity to do something productive. Okay, we talked about, if you take a gap year, what am I going to do? If you go to a PG year, you take courses, hopefully you're going to do extracurricular activities, sports hopefully will be back in place. So there's an opportunity to actually do something to perhaps make yourself more attractive the following year.
Plus, in those cases with the PG schools, because they're usually out in the country, they're outside the epicenters of the virus.
Right, and they're probably going to be pretty safe in that respect. Right. I also think that there are some PG schools, there are some prep schools who have a fairly significant dependence on international students. That's going to create more openings for domestic students. So all of a sudden, if I'm Andover or Exeter and 10 to 15 to 20% of my students are internationals, I might be more inclined to take a domestic kid for a year. So there are going to be opportunities. I think a PG year could actually be an option for a lot of kids to think about this year. Yeah.
Got it. So we actually have quite a few questions in the Q&A panel. So I'm going to go through these, Michael. Mm-hmm. So the person who asked the waitlist question with the two colleges, they're here, and they said the school they didn't get back to their daughter is Boston College, where I did my undergraduate. Okay. They said a nice personal reply to her, first expression of interest email, but no reply to her follow-up note. Sent an update to them. Chris, since you went to BC, any advice on next steps to get accepted? Yeah, actually a few. I've found that the Boston College admissions office is excellent. I mean, frankly, more so than others, better than others in engaging in dialogue with applicants. And I'm not saying that because I graduated from BC. I have students right now. BC's become a very popular place to transfer to, especially for students overseas. And, I think that they've been excellent. So the person who, we tend to, find whoever that person might be, we write that person an email, write them a letter, and they're usually pretty good at getting back. And it's okay to bump or nudge them on the notification after a few days. So if you haven't already, I would just send up a follow-up to your follow-up, and just to confirm that they got the message.
And you could find out in the middle of July that BC needs to get some students, because from somebody else, perhaps a Duke or a Dartmouth or a Cornell, added more from their wait list and pulled a kid away from BC, and BC is now looking for kids. So be willing to say to them, if it's your top choice, I'm willing to stick this out. I'm going to stick this out to the bitter end. Yep.
So Michael, another question here on financial aid for applying to state schools. Mm-hmm. So the question is, would that also apply to state schools regarding contact financial aid for reconsideration? So I think the question here is asking us, if you applied to a state school, you were accepted, can you ask them to recalculate your aid based on your circumstances?
Yeah, financial aid is financial aid, whether you're an in-state, out-of-state student applying to that school, or whether you're applying to a private school. So there's no reason to not ask, okay, in terms of that situation. Cool. Again, because in-state tuition at a state university is quite a bit less than it is at other places. There may be some flexibility. I still think there's going to be that notion of, is it real hardship? And I think you need to be able to document what's going on demonstrate what's happened in terms of the family income, and if it looks like it's something that's going to continue, to make sure the college is aware of that.
Got it. So next question here, recommendation letters, Michael. Recommendation letters are definitely going to be more important for juniors. What makes a strong rec letter during remote learning? If you want to major in computer science, what should a humanities teacher highlight in their letter? Thoughts?
Well, I think it's a combination. Remember that I had this conversation, I'm going to have this conversation too. The guidance counselor is also writing a letter, okay?
Right.
So thinking about who your teacher letters are from, but also what the guidance counselor can include in their letter that might not be coming from those other two teachers can also be equally significant. So that's an important thing to say. I think a teacher who can comment now on how a student has thrived during this period of time is the most significant letter that you can possibly have in terms of the college admission process. And for someone having to deal with computer situations, my God, that's all we're dealing with right now. So in terms of a humanities kid who's been able to perhaps help their teacher with teaching the class remotely, that teacher could add that into their letter in terms of, here's a person who stepped up and helped me with the leadership of the class in terms of remote learning. What a great recommendation that can be. I think students who have achieved great things during remote learning are going to stand out in the applicant pool, because you're absolutely right. Colleges are going to read letters of recommendation this year much more closely than they have in the past.
And I'll add one thing, it's somewhat related, but I think it sort of reinforces the general point here, is that, so the degree that I did at the Ed School at Harvard is Technology, Innovation, Education. And this past year, the faculty and leadership at the Ed School decided to actually change the master's program. Master's programs going from 13 down to like 4 or 5 programs and having like specializations. Anyway, the point is that they're actually going to be eliminating the degree program that I had. But since the start of COVID-19, they have pressed pause on the sort of new master's programs, and they're looking more closely at the Technology, Innovation, and Education program, because it's one that they're actually thinking is one of the more valuable and important degree programs to actually have. And therefore, I think that's another sort of like, a signal that, people who understand technology and learning and can thrive in those online environments are as important as ever.
A great point to add to that, Oberlin College, one of my favorite schools because I worked there for a few years, actually this spring created a course of dealing with education during the COVID crisis. And they actually it was an interdisciplinary course. They brought people in from some of their top academics involved in it, and they actually offered access to the course to prospective students that they were admitting. What a statement that makes in terms of the school understanding how to be sensitive to what's going on right now. A kid who's paying attention to that may say, boy, that's a great place that understands what's going on.
Sorry, that's getting a couple other questions and comments here. Getting a question here, someone's enjoying their experience, wants to come to more webinars. So I'm just giving them some information. Great. So question here from Amy. Any positives for juniors in applying this fall? Do they have better chances anywhere because less international students? I'll take that quickly. Again, I do think this 80-120 rule is going to be in effect. I think it's going to be a less competitive applicant pool. And I think, I'll get to my summary point, when we sort of close out the session, but I think, if you're thinking about applying to college this fall, apply to college this fall. It's going to be probably the best year to apply in probably 5 years. So Michael, anything to add to that? Or
you're talking about the current year right now?
No, right? So I'm saying the current juniors, yes, applying in the fall, do they have better chances, anywhere because of less international? I'm simply saying that I think that, applying to school this fall as a first-year student is going to be a major advantage. And the reason why I say probably, the best time in like the last 5 years, because every single year admissions gets that much more competitive, incrementally. And I think we're going to probably see a big kind of step backwards in just in terms of numbers of applications, and therefore, based on the metrics and the numbers, I think it's going to probably be a great season.
See, I don't know if I agree with that. And I think that's good. We can agree to disagree. I'm a little concerned because they're going to be taking smaller classes. And so the size of the pool of who applies could very well determine that some of these schools, as we answered before, could become more selective because they don't have the spaces in terms of who they're going to take for the following year because they've deferred or let kids gap in terms of that situation. I think where a junior can help themselves right now, however, is something you said before about the entrepreneurial thing. Think about what things you can do as a junior to make yourself more attractive, that you're doing something during this time period that your classmates aren't doing or that other applicants aren't doing, because that's going to be hugely advantageous to you to stand out in that particular applicant pool.
Right. And so there's a comment here from Susie who's just asking for clarification. You know, what I'm saying about the 81-20 rule is that I think that a lot of students are going to be looking to defer. I think that there's also talk of international students overseas, who are current juniors, not applying in the fall. And for that reason, I think that applying this fall, if you're a current junior, not taking a gap year or not deferring or taking a year off, right? I do think that applying this fall, makes a lot of sense. Am I making sense, Michael?
Yeah, I think once we see the numbers of what's going on, I think a lot of it is going to be, we've got to see what kind of numbers colleges have allowed to gap, have allowed to defer, and what they're actually doing in the fall. As we said before, a whole bunch of kids may not show up in the fall when they see what their options are. If I have to have online teaching, I'm just not going to go to college, and so all of a sudden, as I said before, apply as a transfer the following year, because there's going to be spaces, in particular in that sophomore class, if they had a light freshman class.
Got it. So, and then Susie, if you want to talk more about that offline, I can clarify my comments, or maybe I'm not understanding the question. And so something here from Emily regarding New York. Given Governor Cuomo has closed public schools in New York City through year end, how could June ACT happen there? It's a good question. Right? It's a good question. So as far as the ACT happening, again, it's sort of a state by state consideration. There are some students in New York who may look to do standby testing in New Jersey, right? Or maybe kind of going to Connecticut. It depends on where you are. There are some people, if school is not happening, and they can actually travel. Maybe they have, a vacation home in Florida. They can go down to Florida early and then maybe do standby or waitlist testing there. So as far as New York City goes, that's a whole other kind of beast and animal. I would not be surprised if the June ACT doesn't happen in New York City in particular, but I think it's going to happen elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm on a web serve with a lot of.
And also one more thing too, they also may have June ACT, but they also may move. They may allow students in those particular states where they don't have access to tests to take tests online.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, Chris, is I'm on a web serve with a lot of the counselors in New York City. And a lot of them are scrambling, looking for who's going to offer the test in June. And there aren't a lot of people right now even expecting to offer it, never mind what's going on with de Blasio and the schools being closed. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So another question here. As a junior earning a high school degree and associate's degree at the same time, how can I most effectively use my college credits? Go to a not so prestigious school, state school in New York and graduate early and get a master's from a different school, or go to a prestigious private school, not use credits, and do a 5-year bachelor master program at that same school. Did you catch that, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's going to differ from student to student. It's going to differ on what the major is and what the job market is going to be down the road in terms of that particular field. I think the student who's the student who's done a, associate's degree and all the coursework, unfortunately, is in the humanities, which I love because I was a history major. It may not be as much value as someone who can decide how to do it perhaps in the medical profession, in the engineering profession, in the computer science profession, and be able to take it to their advantage. So I don't think it's necessarily the question of the prestige of the school. It's the makeup of the degree and its value once you put it all together. I mean, I went to the University of Connecticut and I loved my time there, but I've had the opportunity to work at Cornell and Brown and Oberlin and Northwestern. So I think a lot of it is what you put together of your degree and use it to your advantage later on is far more important than just necessarily the idea of go to a prestigious school just because that might be better.
Michael, this next question is a perfect question to end on. I love this question. If your dream school that you ED'd rejected you, possibly partially due to financial aid need. And you've done some notable things between then and now to improve your profile. Should you reach out to admissions for reconsideration? Mr. Muska, what do you think?
We've talked about this, Chris. I think in these times, colleges are doing unusual things. I see no harm in terms of asking for a review of your rejection. And the fact that this student can add new information to the file that perhaps makes their application more attractive, all the more reason to go ahead and do it. The worst thing they can say is no again, okay? But they may say, okay, let's open a discussion and continue to talk about this.
So here's a story about a New York City student.
Exactly, right.
Yeah, here's the amazing story. It happened literally this morning. It kind of came to fruition. So a student of mine who went to a Ivy League university. She was a first-year student. She was there were some family issues going on, and she gave me a call. She's like, should I pull out of school? I want to come back and go to school somewhere in New York. I want to be around my family. And I said, we're finished the semester, get some grades in your transcript, and then we can talk about doing a transfer application. Long story short, she pulled out in the middle of her fall semester. The family went through a process. She sort of resurfaced in February, and she's like, I want to go to school in New York. I've made the decision. It's all set. I want to go. Please help me. So we were able to organize a transfer application. And then what happened was this. She got a letter from the admissions office saying, actually, because you didn't finish any of your classes at your previous institution, you don't qualify as a transfer applicant. And this kid was dynamite. Amazing, right? Clear admit, this kid. So she was devastated. And, the truth of the matter was the application deadline was January 1st for the one school in particular that she wanted to go to. But I was like, you know what, let's think about this. Okay. Let's sort of, get ourselves together. Let's get a strategy together. So she wrote back to the school and said, thank you so much for the clarification. Due to my personal circumstances, I was, I was unable to meet that deadline for first year application. Is under, especially given the current, situation with COVID-19 and the fact that you're my first choice school. Is there any way that you could reconsider? They got back to her and they said, okay, we'll allow you to apply as a transfer applicant as long as you're okay with starting the school with no credits. And she said, absolutely. And then today she got the call, they admitted her. And I said to her, you have COVID-19 to thank for this, because this would not have happened in a normal application year. It's because this school in particular is really, really looking at their incoming freshman class and wants to make sure that they're going to have a class next year. That's why this happened. I mean, she's over the moon. So, Michael, any thoughts on that? Or
yeah, I would say that any family, we've had, I'm sure we got a lot more junior families on today than usual, but I think any family that's a senior family and they want to reach out to a school where they're on the wait list or perhaps trying to figure out they still could be reconsidered, I see absolutely no harm in reaching out right now. As I said, the worst they can say is no. At the same time, I worry for the juniors out there. I hope that there's going to be the doors opening. If there's ED, take advantage of it. No question about it. Think about the things, if you can get to visit, go visit. Think about the things that you can do to advantage your application now as we move forward in terms of getting ahead to next year. And start on those essays too. Yeah.
And the final thing I'll say is simply, no matter who you are, whether you're currently in college or you're applying to college, go to college in the fall. Mm-hmm. Go to college in the fall. It's going to be the best move for now, as well as for the long term. Again, if you have any questions, things you want to follow up on, things to kind of clarify that we discussed in this webinar, or just need some help with anything, please feel free to give us a call. We're very, very happy to help. On behalf of Michael and the team at Relativity and the Kate's team, we wish you all the luck, all the best, health and safety, and be safe during this time. Thank you very much and have a great day.